Imagine you are walking into like a perfectly tidy, polite 1950s British living room. You can picture it, right?
Definitely. The tea is poured, fine china is laid out.
Exactly. The manners are just absolutely impeccable. Everyone is speaking in these hushed, respectful tones about the weather or maybe a minor royal engagement. It is the absolute picture of post-war middle-class stability.
Right, because everything is in its proper place, safely locked into this rigid hierarchy. It's a society desperately trying to convince itself that the trauma of the Second World War is entirely in the past.
Yeah, and that respectable, quiet domesticity is the ultimate reward. So you have this suffocatingly polite conversation going on, and then someone casually tosses a live grenade right onto the tea tray.
Just right in the middle of the crumpets.
Yes, it just sits there, fizzing, and then boom! The china shatters, the table is overturned, the polite facade is completely violently blown to pieces, and it leaves everyone in the room deafened and covered in soot.
Which, honestly, is the most accurate way to describe what John Osborne did to the entire British theatrical establishment on May 8th, 1956.
It really is. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, you and I are going on a massive, exhaustive literary and cultural excavation.
A huge one.
Our mission is total mastery of John Osborne's groundbreaking play, Look Back in Anger. If you are studying for an exam, writing a dissertation, or, if you simply want a comprehensive crash course in the exact moment modern British drama was born, you are in the right place.
By the time we finish today, you're going to understand the mechanics, the history, and the bleeding psychological core of this play inside and out.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really understand the sheer explosive anger of these characters, we first have to understand the world they are so angry at, right?
Right. We have to look at the physical and historical space this text was born into. And the best place to start is an essential distinction you have to make when analyzing any play. I mean, the difference between drama and theater.
Which people mix up all the time.
They really do. It is a crucial distinction. And blurring the two is a trap so many people fall into when analyzing literature. Drama refers to the written text itself.
The words on the page.
Exactly. It is the fiction, the dialogue, the stage directions. But theater, on the other hand, is the physical sensory execution of that text. It's the three-dimensional space.
It involves the lighting design, casting shadows, the smell of the dust on the stage.
Right. The acoustics of the room, the
Yeah.
costumes, and arguably most importantly, the live breathing audience reacting in real time.
Because when you read Look Back in Anger in a classroom, or in your bedroom, you are engaging with the drama.
But to analyze it effectively,
Right.
you must constantly project it into the realm of theater in your mind. You have to imagine it as a live event communicating meaning to a captive crowd.
It's the exact difference between like a musical score and the live concert. The drama is the sheet music. You can sit in a library, read the notes, study the theory, analyze the time signature.
You can understand it intellectually, sure.
But the theater is the orchestra actually playing it in a cramped, sweaty venue. The impact relies on the instruments, the distortion, the volume, and just the energy of the crowd packed in around you.
You cannot judge a punk rock concert just by reading the lyrics on a piece of paper.
No, you really can't. And to understand why Osborne's particular concert was so deafening to the audiences of the time, you have to look at the acoustics of 1950s Britain.
Which was an era defined by a massive, almost dizzying cultural paradox.
The paradox of the post-war victory, because on paper, everything was looking up, right?
Oh, absolutely. Britain had survived and won the Second World War. The Labour government under Clement Attlee had swept in and established the welfare state, which, that was a monumental shift.
It changed everything.
It did. For
Yeah.
the first time, there was unprecedented Social Security. You had universal health care through the NHS, subsidized housing, pensions. By the mid-1950s, the economy was genuinely recovering.
The rationing that had plagued the country for a decade finally ended.
Right. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan captured the political mood perfectly when he famously declared, "You never had it so good."
And culturally, the media was pushing this narrative of a new Elizabethan age. With the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953, you had more people with disposable income.
And crucially, there was a blurring of class lines. Working-class individuals were suddenly gaining access to higher education through state funding.
Yeah, they were attending the new red brick universities rather than just the elite, ancient institutions like Oxford and Cambridge.
The standard of living was demonstrably statistically higher.
So put yourself in the shoes of a 1950s citizen. If everyone is better off economically, if the safety net is finally there, if you are educated and fed, Why on earth is the undercurrent of society so miserable, cynical, and just utterly disillusioned?
Well, because material comfort and state-sponsored survival do not automatically translate to a sense of individual purpose. You have to look at the macro geopolitics pressing down on these people.
Like the end of the empire.
Exactly. Yes, they had free healthcare, but Britain was simultaneously watching the rapid, humiliating collapse of its empire. That was punctuated by Indian independence and the Suez Canal crisis.
They went from being a global superpower dictating world events to a secondary player in a new world order.
And on top of that, the Cold War was freezing the globe. The hydrogen bomb was an existential terror looming over every waking moment.
It's wild to think about. You have this utopian socialist vision of domestic welfare crashing headfirst into a terrifying, purposeless global reality.
Which breeds deep ambivalence. It's a state where you are paralyzed by conflicting emotions.
And J.B. Priestley, the playwright, he diagnosed this cultural paralysis brilliantly. He essentially argued that there were three distinct Englands coexisting and really fighting for dominance in the national psyche.
Right, the first being Old England.
Yeah, Old England. This is the romanticized, nostalgic country of cathedrals, sprawling manor houses, parsons and squires. It's this pastoral myth. Then you have 19th century England, which is the grimy industrial reality.
The coal, the iron, railways, and Victorian sweat.
Exactly. But the tragedy for the post-war generation was that both of those Englands, the romantic and the industrial, were dying out.
They were receding into history, and they were taking all their grand, organizing narratives with them. And what was replacing them? Priestley identified a third iteration, which he called New England.
Which wasn't really English at all.
No, it was an increasingly Americanized, consumer-driven, mass-produced suburban society. It was an England of standardized chain stores, television sets, and glossy magazines.
Which leaves a whole generation completely unmoored. I mean, imagine being a young, working-class man who just fought a brutal, morally absolute war against fascism, or being the younger brother who grew up in the shadow of that heroism.
Right.
You finally get a university education, you step out into the world ready to make your mark, and you find a culture that feels hollow, Americanized, and entirely devoid of the grand, heroic causes of the past.
There are no dragons left to slay, just a mortgage to pay and a television to watch.
And this cultural hollowness was perfectly mirrored in the dramatic context of the era, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The British stage in the early 1950s was dominated by a style called realism or naturalism. This meant the plays featured everyday prose, highly realistic middle-class living room sets, and they were what we call well-made plays.
Meaning neat, predictable plot structures.
Exactly. Everything is resolved before the curtain falls. Playwrights like Terence Rattigan and Noel Coward ruled the West End. It was theater designed to be safe, respectable, and entirely unthreatening to the establishment.
While meanwhile, across the channel, European drama was experimenting wildly with expressionism, right? Avant-garde staging, exploring inner psychological states.
Breaking the fourth wall and alienating the audience through Bertolt Brecht's theories. Honestly, British theater was effectively a polite dinner party, while European theater was an intellectual riot.
And this is where we have to look closely at Osborne's structural genius, because he didn't actually burn down the realist structure to stage his riot. He used it as a Trojan horse.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Look back. Anger takes place entirely in a single, cramped, dingy attic flat in the Midlands. The characters spend the play doing incredibly mundane things. I mean, Alison irons shirts, Jimmy and Cliff read the Sunday papers, they make tea.
If you just look at the set design and the stage directions, it looks exactly like a standard, safe, British naturalist play.
But Osborne uses that mundane, highly realistic container to smuggle in explosive, almost expressionistic psychological intensity. The structure is pure realism, but the emotional content is pure expressionism.
He lulls the 1956 audience into a false sense of security. They think they're watching a standard domestic drama, and then he unleashes a protagonist who verbally incinerates the entire room.
It's a grenade on the tea tray. He traps the audience in the familiar living room, and then he pulls the pin. Which brings us perfectly to the man holding that grenade, Jimmy Porter.
We really need to zoom in from the macro societal level of post-war Britain to the micro level of this play's protagonist.
Because if you are analyzing this text, you have to figure out what makes Jimmy tick. His psychology drives every ounce of the play's momentum. So let's evaluate him through a few different theoretical models of character.
Evaluating characters through established theoretical models is really the best way to move beyond saying he's an angry guy to actually understanding his function in the narrative.
Right.
So, If we start with the oldest framework, the Aristotelian model of tragedy, we hit an immediate dead end.
Because under Aristotle's rules, a tragic hero is a person of high status, usually a king or a noble, whose fatal flaw leads to a downfall that shakes the foundations of the entire society.
And Jimmy Porter is obviously not a king. He is a highly educated man who stubbornly runs a sweet stall in the local market. He isn't shaping society, he is suffocated by it. So classical tragedy just fails to categorize him.
But then there's the medieval theory of humors, which offers a surprisingly sticky, if somewhat reductive, angle.
Right, the theory of humors. This is the archaic medical idea that human temperament is entirely dictated by the balance of four bodily fluids.
Mm-hmm.
Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile.
Which corresponds to being sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, or melancholic.
Precisely.
Huh.
And if we apply this to Jimmy, one could argue that his relentless, scorching anger isn't a complex intellectual political protest at all. It might just be his inherent biological constitution.
Like he just has an excess of yellow bile.
Right. He is fundamentally choleric. This model essentializes his character. It suggests his rage is an unalterable force of nature rather than a reasoned response to his environment.
But I have to push back on that. Viewing Jimmy just as a biological anger machine robs him of all his agency and intellect, which we know he possesses in spades.
He is incredibly articulate.
Exactly. He is too articulate to just be a slave to his humors. I think examining him through the tension between the romantic and the modernist models of character is far more revealing.
Oh, definitely. Let's look at the romantic model first. In literary romanticism, the hero is this isolated, passionate, burning genius. Their soul is simply too vast and intense for the mundane, petty world to handle, so they suffer beautifully in isolation.
And that is exactly how Jimmy Porter views himself. He desperately wants to be a romantic hero. He indulges in this relentless, self-conscious posturing. He acts like he's a revolutionary poet standing at the barricades during the French Revolution, fighting a grand, solitary battle against tyranny.
In fact, Helena, the upper-class friend who moves into the flat, explicitly calls him out on this. She notes that Jimmy acts as if he is still living in the French Revolution. He's deeply aware of his own performance.
Which brings in the modernist view, heavily influenced by Freudian psychoanalysis. Because modernism completely rejects the idea of a consistent, unified hero. It accepts that human nature is fractured, illogical, and defined by deep alienation.
Freud introduced the vital concept of ambivalence, the psychological reality that you can simultaneously harbor intense love and intense, violent hatred for the exact same object or person.
And Jimmy embodies ambivalence perfectly. His sense of self is not fixed. He fluctuates wildly between vicious cruelty and sudden, desperate vulnerability, especially toward his wife, Allison.
Building on that structural analysis of his character, we have to look at how he functions within the plot. This is where Sourio's actantial model becomes an invaluable tool.
Etienne Souriau, the narrative theorist.
Right. He argued that characters shouldn't just be analyzed as fake people. They should be analyzed as actants, performing specific structural mathematical roles within a narrative.
He identified several roles, but three are really critical for understanding Jimmy's paralysis, right?
Yes. First, you have the lion, which is the forceful, driving protagonist. That is undeniably Jimmy. He initiates all the dramatic force. Then you have Mars, the rival or the antagonist, blocking the protagonist.
For Jimmy, Mars is the British upper-class establishment, frequently embodied by Allison's absent aristocratic mother, whom Jimmy relentlessly verbally abuses.
So you have the lion roaring at Mars. But the most crucial part of Sourio's model when applied to this play is the element he calls the scale. The scale is the structural distributor of justice.
Like in a traditional story, the scale is God, or a righteous king, or a functioning legal system, or even just a coherent moral universe that steps in to reward the good and punish the wicked.
Right. And if you look back in anger through Sourio's model, the scale is completely, terrifyingly missing.
Oh, wow. No scale at all.
Exactly. And that structural absence is the root of Jimmy's profound existential frustration. There is no scale in post-war Britain. There is no God, no grand moral framework, no political revolution that can step in, validate his pain, and set the world right.
So he is a lion constantly attacking Mars, but because there is no scale to officially declare a victor or bring balance, the fight is eternal and completely futile.
That perfectly explains why his anger feels like a spinning tire that can't catch traction. Now, contrast Jimmy with how Osborne constructs the older generation.
Right. If you're analyzing character types, you have to talk about E.M. Forster's concept of flat versus round characters.
A flat character is a caricature. They have only one defining feature and they never change. A round character is complex, contradictory, and capable of surprise.
And before we ever meet Allison's father, Colonel Redfern, Jimmy talks about him extensively. Jimmy paints him entirely as a flat character, a dusty, irrelevant relic of the Edwardian era, an imperialist cartoon who spent his life exploiting India.
But the brilliance of the play structure is how it subverts Jimmy's narrative. When Colonel Redfern actually arrives on stage in the second act to take Allison away, he completely defies the flat caricature Jimmy created.
He is undeniably round.
He is. He is gentle, he is capable of deep self-reflection, and most surprisingly, he openly admits his own obsolescence. He knows his world is dead. He tells Allison, "I'm an old plant left over from the Edwardian wilderness."
He even displays a shocking amount of sympathy for Jimmy, recognizing a shared sense of displacement, since both of them feel they are living in a time that has no use for them.
By making the Colonel round, Osborne forces the audience to realize that Jimmy is an unreliable narrator. Jimmy's political anger blinds him to the actual humanity of the people he claims to hate.
Which leads to a crucial debate you really have to be ready to address if you were writing about this play. The British press famously labeled Jimmy Porter the quintessential angry young man and heralded him as the voice of a whole generation's political dissent.
But when you critically examine the text, you really have to push back on that label.
Yeah, I mean, is Jimmy actually a crusader for social change? Because he doesn't do anything. He doesn't organize a union. He doesn't vote, as far as we know. He doesn't protest. He just yells at his wife while she irons.
Right. Is he a revolutionary, or is he just a highly educated narcissist throwing a massive articulate tantrum because he's bored with his life?
That pushback is entirely validated by the text itself, isn't it?
It is. Even Osborne's own stage directions cast doubt on Jimmy's revolutionary credentials. Osborne describes him early on as almost non-committal and a loudmouth. The critic Kenneth Alsop provided a much more accurate framework when he suggested the defining condition of this generation wasn't anger, but rather dissensions.
Dissensions. Let's break that down because it's a vital distinction.
Well, anger implies a focused emotion directed at a specific, solvable injustice. You are angry at a law, so you march to change it. Dissensions, on the other hand, is a condition of unfocused, all-pervasive resentment.
It is a chronic emotional state that is purely negative.
Exactly. It is a rejection of everything without offering a positive alternative for anything. Jimmy's rage is dissent without a direction. He famously laments in the play, "There aren't any good, brave causes left."
He wants the glory of the fight, but he has no political vision for the future. And because his political anger is completely impotent, because he has no grand revolution to lead in the streets, he has to find a smaller stage where he can actually wield power.
And he's a target.
Right. And unfortunately for his wife, he turns his marriage into his personal war zone. If Jimmy can't overthrow the government, he will overthrow the domestic peace of his own living room. Which brings us to the actual battleground of the play, the brutal lived realities of class and gender.
The class warfare in this play is incredibly intimate, fought entirely within the claustrophobic geography of that attic flat. You have four main characters. Jimmy and his loyal, easygoing friend Cliff are solidly working class. Jimmy's wife Allison and her actress friend Helena are upper middle class.
The tension is palpable, but Jimmy's class status is deeply contradictory. I mean, he isn't a miner or a factory worker. He went to a red brick university. He is highly educated. He reads intellectual Sunday papers. He argues about literature.
He has the cultural capital to join the middle class.
Yet he stubbornly chooses to run a sweet stall in a local market. He actively limits his own economic potential. Why does he do that?
Because the sweet stall is a deliberate, paradoxical rejection of the very upward mobility the 1950s welfare state was trying to offer him. If he takes a white-collar job, he becomes part of the phony establishment he despises.
So by running a sweet stall, he maintains his working-class authenticity as an act of rebellion.
Furthermore, it is an act of aggression against Allison. He forces his upper-class wife, who was raised in luxury, to live in squalor. The play completely conflates the Marxist class struggle with the battle of the sexes.
Jimmy attacks Allison not just because she is his wife, but because her body and her background represent the establishment.
When they talk about the decline of imperialism in the play, it isn't just a geopolitical reality about Britain losing India. Imperialism becomes a direct metaphor for dominance, submission, and colonization within their marriage. Jimmy wants to colonize Allison's upper-class identity and break it down.
Which makes viewing the play through a feminist perspective not just interesting, but absolutely mandatory. And we have to impartially examine this academic critique because the text demands it. Because Jimmy's monologues are saturated with extreme, violent misogyny. He constantly equates women with destruction and consumption. He compares them to butchers bleeding men dry. He says they are out to devour his soul.
His rhetoric frames female sexuality and domesticity as an existential threat to his autonomy. He cannot attack the abstract concept of the Cold War, so he attacks the women in the room for tying him down to the mundane realities of domestic life.
It's exactly that. He is using women as scapegoats for his own existential dread. Because he lacks a good, brave cause, he blames the women around him for emasculating him. And feminist criticism looks past Jimmy's loud justifications to examine how the play itself structurally positions these women.
The prominent critic Mary McCarthy provided a devastating analysis of this dynamic. She argues that the female characters in Look Back in Anger are essentially treated by the narrative as entirely interchangeable.
Interchangeable, yeah. If you want to understand the play's underlying attitude toward gender, you have to look at the ironing scene.
The physical action of ironing is the central visual motif of the play.
It really is. In the first act, Allison stands at the ironing board, silently working, while Jimmy and Cliff lounge around reading the Sunday papers and arguing about politics. Allison is physically exhausted and emotionally battered by Jimmy's tirades. Eventually, the abuse becomes too much, and Allison leaves him.
But then, look at the brilliant, chilling structural repetition Osborne uses. Allison leaves, and her upper-class friend Helena, who previously despised Jimmy, ends up sleeping with him and taking Allison's place in the flat.
And when the curtain rises on Act 3, it is the exact same visual tableau.
Exactly. The men are sitting around reading the Sunday papers, and Helena is standing at the ironing board, silently working. McCarthy's argument is that within the world of this play, the individual identity of the woman doesn't matter.
The female characters exist strictly to maintain the domestic space for the men. Jimmy just swapped out one upper-class hostage for another, and the patriarchal machine of the flat just kept running smoothly.
It is a profound structural indictment. Furthermore, we must ask a critical question about Allison's narrative arc. When Allison finally summons the courage to leave Jimmy, which is arguably her only moment of true independence, self-assertion, and survival in the entire narrative, how does the text frame it?
The text frames it almost as a betrayal of Jimmy's suffering. The play structurally seems to demand that she be punished for abandoning her post.
And, indeed, while she is away, she suffers horribly. She loses the baby she was carrying.
When she returns in the final scene, she is physically broken, crawling back to Jimmy, begging for forgiveness for having left him, crying that she finally understands the pain he talks about.
The grim implication is that female identity in this world is deeply, inescapably compromised by patriarchal structures. Even rebellion against the status quo and Look Back in Anger is heavily coded as an exclusively male privilege.
The women are just collateral damage in Jimmy's private war against the world. So if we accept that the cramped apartment is the battleground, and this marriage is the proxy war for a generation's class frustration, then we must examine the weaponry being used.
Because aside from a brief scuffle where an ironing board gets knocked over, no one really throws a physical punch in this play. Yet the atmosphere is saturated with violence.
And that violence is carried entirely by language, which means we need to move from analyzing what they are fighting about to analyzing how they fight.
Some critics argue that language itself is the actual driving protagonist of Look Back in Anger. The plot doesn't move forward because people take actions. The plot moves forward because people deploy speeches.
Osborne injected a raw, aggressive, working-class rhetorical energy into the British stage that simply hadn't existed there before.
However, a crucial analytical point is that this language completely lacks objectivity. You cannot trust anything Jimmy says as empirical fact because his language is entirely colored by self-pity, theatricality, and melodrama.
Take, for instance, Jimmy's famous, haunting monologue about his father's death. He describes watching his father die when he was 10 years old. He claims that sitting by that deathbed taught him more about love and betrayal than Allison will ever know in her entire life.
It's an incredibly tragic, moving story. But look at how he uses it in the scene. He isn't sharing this deep trauma with his wife to foster intimacy or seek comfort.
No, he is using the memory of his dead father as a blunt rhetorical instrument to win an argument. He brings it up specifically to make Allison feel inadequate, to prove that his working-class suffering makes him morally superior to her upper-class comfort.
He weaponizes his own trauma.
Exactly. To master this play, you must be able to categorize the specific kinds of speech Osborne employs. The first and most prominent is invective.
Right. Invective is essentially highly abusive, violent, denunciatory language. It is a sustained verbal attack.
Jimmy's monologues are absolute masterclasses in invective. He doesn't just disagree with people, he tries to verbally annihilate them. He targets the upper classes, the clergy, politicians, American culture, and particularly his mother-in-law, whom he repeatedly refers to as an overfed, repulsive worm.
It's a scattergun of rhetorical rage aimed at anything he deems phony. The second major linguistic tool is hyperbole.
Extreme exaggeration used for emotional emphasis rather than literal truth.
Right. Jimmy uses it constantly, claiming his heart is breaking or that he is bleeding to death from the boredom of Sunday afternoons. But what is fascinating is that the hyperbole is infectious. Almost everyone in the flat gets swept up in it.
Even Allison, who is usually restrained, finally cracks and cries out, "I want to be a corrupt and futile."
The language of the flat forces everyone to operate at maximum emotional volume, with the sole exception of the restrained, Edwardian Colonel Redfern, who speaks in quiet, measured, literal sentences.
And the third major tool is parody. Jimmy is a relentless mimic. He cannot engage with an idea without mocking it. He parodies evangelical preachers, fast-talking salesmen, pretentious literary academics, and upper-class partygoers.
He even unconsciously parodies the tragic romantic hero trope we discussed earlier.
Which is so interesting. This reliance on parody and monologue raises a devastating question about Jimmy's psychology. Does his constant mimicry, his endless stream of performative speeches, mean he is fundamentally incapable of having a genuine conversation?
Yes. When you look at the dialogue structure, the answer is undeniably yes. The play relies heavily on monologues for self-dramatization. Jimmy is always performing.
He is hyper-aware of his audience, whether he is trying to entertain Cliff, horrify Allison, or shock the actual theater audience sitting in the dark.
Genuine dialogue, actual reciprocal back-and-forth communication where two people listen and respond is incredibly rare.
When it does happen, it usually signals a brief, incredibly fragile moment of genuine connection, which is almost immediately shattered when Jimmy steps back onto his soapbox and resumes the performance.
We also must ground this high-flying rhetoric by examining the play's physical imagery and symbolism. The most prominent physical objects in the play are the Sunday newspapers.
They are everywhere. Every single act begins with the men buried behind them.
The Sunday papers are the physical conduit that brings the macro public world into the micro private domestic space.
They drag the politics, the society columns, and the cultural reviews into the attic. They provide the literal fuel for Jimmy's rage. He reads an article about an elite party, and it triggers a 10-minute monologue about class inequality.
Without the papers feeding him the outside world, his anger would have no raw material to process.
And we must analyze the symbolism of the title itself. Look back in anger. This is a brilliant subversion.
Traditionally, when we think of looking back or retrospection, we assume it implies a state of calm, detached objectivity, the wisdom of hindsight.
But Osborne aggressively links looking back with the immediate, hot emotion of anger. He is arguing a radical point, that intense, subjective, burning emotion is actually what provides clear vision.
For Osborne and Jimmy, polite objectivity is just a form of blindness. Anger is the fire that burns away the social hypocrisy and allows you to see the truth of the past.
But then right in the middle of all this articulate rage, all this high-minded rhetoric and vicious invective, you have the most jarring, bizarre element of the play. The bear and squirrel game.
Oh, yes.
Jimmy and Allison literally pretend to be stuffed animals. They keep plush toys on a dresser, and in their private moments, they mimic them. They make animal noises. They call each other a poor old bear and a bushy-tailed squirrel. It is incredibly unsettling to read.
It is deeply unsettling, but psychologically, it is the most vital mechanism in their marriage.
Yeah.
The bear and squirrel game is a deliberate, desperate retreat.
It is a psychological regression from the complexities of adult vocabulary, adult responsibility, and the agonizing pain of their socioeconomic reality.
They retreat into a pre-linguistic, instinctual, infantile state. It is the only space in the entire play where they are not actively trying to destroy each other.
Because language is the weapon they use to tear each other apart. So to find affection, they have to completely abandon language. They devolve into animals because animals don't understand class warfare or nuclear anxiety.
But the tragedy of the game is that it is ultimately a pretend solution. It doesn't heal their trauma, it just throws a blanket over it.
It is an escape mechanism that guarantees nothing in the real world will ever improve. And navigating the depths of that trauma requires us to look at the play from multiple distinct academic angles.
Think of literary theories like putting on different pairs of glasses to look at the exact same text. Each lens filters out certain elements and highlights completely different secrets. If you are preparing for an exam, demonstrating that you can apply these different lenses is absolutely crucial.
So let's put on the first pair of glasses, the psychoanalytic lens.
This approach relies on Sigmund Freud's concepts of the unconscious and the psychological defense mechanisms of displacement and projection.
If we look specifically at Freud's topographical model of the mind, the id, the ego, and the superego, Jimmy's erratic behavior takes on a deeply structural dimension.
To see this in action, let's look at how Jimmy operates. The id is the primal, instinctual, irrational drive. It wants immediate gratification and lashes out in rage when denied. The superego is the internalized rules of society, politeness, and morality.
And the ego is the conscious mind frantically trying to balance the two. A psychoanalytic reading suggests that Jimmy's sudden, terrifying swings from quiet domesticity to extreme, violent cruelty are moments where his superego completely fails.
His societal filter breaks down, and the raw, destructive drives of the id take total control of his language.
And we can trace the origin of that specific trauma. His aggression toward Allison isn't just about her being upper class, it is a displaced psychodrama.
As we discussed, Jimmy is obsessed with the memory of his dying father. He explicitly mentions that his mother largely neglected his father during his final days, leaving the young Jimmy to sit by the deathbed alone.
Psychoanalytically, Jimmy's intense, generalized misogyny and his desperate need to punish Allison can be read as Osborne's own unresolved childhood grief, and Jimmy's unconscious hatred of his mother's abandonment displaced onto his adult wife.
He is projecting a childhood trauma onto his marriage, punishing Allison for the sins of a mother she never met.
That completely recontextualizes his anger from political to deeply pathologically personal. Okay, take off those glasses. Let's put on a pair of new criticism glasses.
Now, new criticism is a totally different beast. This approach demands that you completely ignore the author's biography. You ignore Freud. You ignore the 1950s welfare state. You look only at the words printed on the page.
I like to think of new criticism like analyzing a locked escape room. You can't ask the architect why they built the room, and you don't care what city the room is in. You can only use the clues, the puzzles, and the structural architecture physically locked inside the room with you to understand how it functions.
That is the perfect analogy. A new critic reading Look Back in Anger ignores post-war Britain and looks purely at structure, motif, and atmosphere within the text.
For instance, they would analyze how the play builds psychological tension through offstage sound. Throughout the play, the ringing of church bells outside the flat periodically interrupts Jimmy's monologues.
A new critic explores how those bells act as an auditory symbol of the oppressive, traditional world trying to invade his space. They would analyze the visual motif of Allison's ironing board as a physical anchor of domestic stasis.
And crucially, a new critic would focus on the cyclical mirrored structure we mentioned earlier. The fact that the first act with Allison ironing and the third act with Helena ironing are perfectly identical in their staging.
The new critic uses that structural repetition to prove the play's central thematic point, that despite all the screaming and emotional violence, absolutely no narrative progress has been made. The architecture of the play is a perfect, inescapable circle.
Now, take off the new criticism glasses and put on the historicist criticism glasses, specifically a branch called cultural materialism. This is the exact opposite of new criticism.
Cultural materialism refuses to treat the text as an isolated escape room. It demands that we read the literary text right alongside non-literary historical documents and economic data from the exact same period.
This is where it gets fascinating. The study guide brings in a piece of real sociological data from a 1960s socialist commentary on the British Labour Party.
Right. The data details a massive demographic shift. Manual workers were acquiring higher earnings, transitioning into white-collar administrative jobs, crossing traditional class lines, and leaving behind the fixed, rigid stations of the past. There was a boom in social mobility.
Yes. And when you read that real historical economic data alongside the play, it entirely shifts how we view Jimmy's career choice. Jimmy is university educated. He has the vocabulary and the credentials to easily join this new, mobile, white-collar workforce.
But he actively, stubbornly refuses to participate in the new economy. He chooses to run a sweet stall.
Suddenly, through a historicist lens, this choice isn't just a quirky character trait or a sign of laziness, it is a highly politicized, deliberate economic strike against the changing system.
He is violently rejecting the bourgeois upward mobility that the 1950s welfare state was so proud of manufacturing.
It changes everything. It proves exactly why you have to look at a text through multiple lenses. Depending on the glasses you wear, you get a psychological thriller, a structural trap, or a Marxist economic protest. You get three entirely different plays.
Now, let's zoom out completely from the text itself to look at the crater this play left in the cultural landscape and examine John Osborne's complicated legacy.
The impact of Look Back in Anger when it premiered at the Royal Court Theatre simply cannot be overstated. The prominent, incredibly influential theater critic Kenneth Tynan famously hailed it as a minor miracle.
He wrote in his review that he could not love anyone who did not wish to see this play. Arthur Miller, the great American playwright, called it the only modern English play.
It suddenly, violently, and eloquently gave voice to the unarticulated grievances and the stifling claustrophobia of an entire generation. But here is the grand irony of theatrical history. Osborne absolutely hated the legacy the media forced upon him, didn't he?
He genuinely loved it. He despised the idea that he was a spokesman for a political movement. He hated the angry young man label.
He famously complained that he was being treated as the Wall's ice cream man of his generation, expected to just hand out neatly packaged anger to anyone who asked.
Osborne always fiercely maintained that he was not writing a political manifesto. He argued he was writing about private pain, about the agonizing personal failures of love, intimacy, and morality in a modern marriage.
But the public completely appropriated it. The rhetorical fire of Jimmy Porter was so intoxicating, so forcefully delivered, that society hijacked the character, ignored his vicious domestic abuse, and turned him into a heroic political mascot.
So how does a writer follow up a cultural earthquake that was completely misunderstood by the people who praised it? Where did Osborne go from there?
Well, he deliberately pivoted to prove he was more than just a realist provocateur. His next major play, The Entertainer, was a massive stylistic departure.
He completely abandoned the naturalist living room and used Brechtian music hall staging, complete with direct address vaudeville acts, to create a metaphor for the pathetic, crumbling decline of the British Empire.
He also tackled historical drama with Luther, a play about Martin Luther sparking the Protestant Reformation.
Right, but his Luther wasn't really a play about theological debates. It explored the same psychological rebellion we see in Jimmy Porter, the isolated, physically tormented individual fighting against a massive, corrupt authority, which in this case was the Catholic Church.
But crucially, unlike Jimmy Porter, who was paralyzed by a lack of causes, Luther actually had a world-changing cause to champion.
Osborne also wrote A Patriot for Me, which explored themes of homosexuality and Jewish identity in the Austro-Hungarian military. It was a fascinating blend of public espionage and agonizing private isolation, which again challenged the censorship of the British stage.
And we should mention his later work, Time Present, which is notable because after facing years of valid feminist criticism regarding the interchangeability of women in his early work, he finally featured a strong, articulate, dominant female protagonist.
Showing his evolution as a writer as he moved into the late 1960s. If we synthesize Osborne's entire career, a very clear thematic through line emerges.
He is perpetually obsessed with the solitary, deeply flawed individual pushed up against the crushing, hypocritical weight of institutional authority.
He is always searching for a genuine private morality in a world dominated by public hypocrisy. And his core, unshakable belief, the engine of his entire dramatic output, is that raw, messy, articulate feeling is far more honest and far more valuable than polite, rational, suppressed thought.
Let's bring it all home. We have covered the macro history of post-war Britain, the theoretical character models of our anti-hero, the class warfare disguised as a toxic marriage, the weaponized language, the multiple critical lenses, and the massive misunderstood legacy of the play. So, what does this all mean for you?
It means that Look Back in Anger is not just a dusty historical relic of 1950s sociology. It is an absolute masterclass in how private trauma and public disillusionment bleed into one another until you can't tell the difference.
It forces us to examine our own outrage and asks us whether our anger is actually a productive tool for social change or if it is just a loud theatrical performance we use to mask our own profound pain and inadequacy.
And on that note, I want to leave you with a lingering, provocative thought. Something to really chew on that wasn't directly answered in our sources today, but that you must grapple with if you want to understand the soul of this text.
Think about the final moments of the play. After all the vicious invective, all the shattered china, all the grand sweeping speeches about the lack of brave causes and the decay of the empire, how do Jimmy and Allison actually survive the end of the day?
They retreat, they slide their arms around each other, the political rhetoric evaporates, and they revert to their infantile bear and squirrel game.
They literally play pretend as fuzzy, timid animals to hide from the agonizing reality of the world. So here's the question you have to ask yourself. If a generation's absolute defining masterpiece about social anger and political rebellion concludes with the characters playing make-believe animals in an attic just to escape their pain, does the play actually believe that real social change is possible?
Or is John Osborne secretly telling us that anger, no matter how eloquent, no matter how politically justified, is ultimately just another cage we build for ourselves?
You can throw the grenade into the polite living room, you can blow the fine china to pieces, and you can scream until your throat bleeds. But when the smoke finally clears and the echoes die down, you are still just sitting in the exact same room, surrounded by the rubble, with absolutely nowhere to go.